The People's Republic of China, the world's largest economy and the largest population, the world's longest continuous civilization, one of the world's largest polluters and emitters of greenhouse gases, and at the same time, the world's leading developers in green energy. My name is Professor John Kennedy, and I'm at the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas. I'm also a professor of political science. I've been studying China since 1994, going back and forth almost every year since then. I teach classes and conduct research on political and social development. I've spent a significant amount of time in rural China and urban China, in some of the smaller villages and some of the largest cities. I also, when I think of China, I think of the people, the society, and also my good friends. I've had a remarkable pleasure to work with some of the same people over the years, as well as meeting new people every time I go back. Today, I want to talk about the People's Republic of China, looking at its history, geography, and looking at the social and political development over the last 2,000 years, basically within around 20 minutes. China borders 14 countries. So you can see a significant difference between the United States and China, which we only border 2 countries. You can see here where China is basically the same size as the United States. When we superimpose the map of China over the United States, this is very clear and evident. However, the population is 1.4 billion. That is more than 4 times the population of the United States. China also has the world's largest economy. As a national economy, measured in GDP, gross domestic product, China has a larger economy than the United States. However, if you look at per capita and income at the individual level, we see that the United States surpasses China by much more than national economy. This suggests a gap between the national economy and individual income. But what's really fascinating about the People's Republic of China is the amount of confidence people have in the Chinese Communist Party. China is a single-party authoritarian regime, and the Chinese Communist Party basically runs China, and the central government, China is a unitary government, and we can see here that the vast majority of the population tends to have a significant amount of confidence within the central leadership in the Chinese Communist Party. As a matter of fact, this has been consistent over the last 20 years. We've seen this kind of approval rating over 80%, sometimes over 90%. And this is not just because people are afraid to say that they're not satisfied with the central government. In fact, we see that people report that they're not very satisfied with local governments. So they're not unafraid to say that they're not satisfied with governments, but they tend to have a lot of confidence and satisfaction and support for the central government in China and the Chinese Communist Party. If we look at a comparison to the United States, you can clearly see that confidence in the federal government of the United States tends to be much lower. Even at the height, after 9/11 in 2001, we got up to 60%. But in general, the confidence rating and support for the federal government tends to be around 20%. So why do Chinese citizens display such a high level of confidence for the Chinese Communist Party and their authoritarian central government? It's an interesting question. The reason is basically 2. First, national pride, that the Chinese Communist Party has really risen China above what they call the century of humiliation. And that Chinese history over the last century plays a significant role in explaining why the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese central government enjoys such a high level, a relatively high level of confidence and support from the population. Second is social stability and economic development. Rapid economic development. China was, when I first went to China in 1994, it was about 75% of the population was rural, living in the countryside. In 2020, it is 40% live in the countryside. Rapid urbanization, a huge increase in incomes relatively over time, and also an improved quality of life. For most, but not all Chinese. This explains the higher level of confidence we tend to see in the government. Understanding China today, we need a brief overview of the historical and political development. Historical, cultural, institutional legacies that influence Chinese political system and society today. The past glory of the Silk Road. Over a century ago, China was the top and leading global economic power. To the century of humiliation, from 1840s to the 1940s, China was considered the sick man of Asia, and it has influenced leaders today and the population. There was also past chaos of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, where the country was in complete disarray for several years, and the desire for social stability. That is, to keep the country at a level where they can develop economically, but also have a level of stability and security. These are the things that kind of set up the historical development of China. So there are three principal time periods when we look at Chinese long history. Remember, connecting it to that continuous civilization. The height of Chinese rules during the Tang Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty, almost 1,000 years ago, and the Silk Road. From the 1840s to the 1940s, China had a weak central governments. It was also known as a century of humiliation. And then the post-century of humiliation. This is 1949, and the introduction of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, which was established in 1949. This is the Mao Zedong was the leader at the time, and we call this the Maoist Period, from 1949 to his death in 1976. And then after, we call it the post-Mao or the Market Reform Period, and this is China today. So the ancient Silk Road in China from 100 BC to the 1400s. We can see here that at the time Europe was in what they call the Dark Ages, China was at its height. We see China really, truly the first real global economic power. The Silk Road connected from Asia to Europe, both over land and over sea. And these were generally the first global trade routes. This was trading both market and goods, but also ideas and religion came through these roads. The Imperial Period goes from 200 BC to 1911, ending with the Qing Dynasty. At the height of the Qing Dynasty, in the beginning, Emperor Kangxi, China still had a relatively strong administrative system and a strong central government. However, that was weakened through internal strife and external influence. And China basically, through the imperial system, started to deteriorate from the inside. And the last empress was Cixi. From a formidable military and administrative system, the Qing dynasty was soon corrupted and had weak central administration. This corruption and weak central administration basically weakened the ability of the central government to have control over the whole landmass of China. Difficulty in managing the population, regional variations, there was civil wars, and there was this notion of trying to control local officials, which was very difficult. There was a saying in China, it said, "Heaven is high and the emperor is far away." The further you are away from the power center, Beijing, the more local officials can get away with. The weak central government also meant that China was vulnerable to outside and foreign attack and control. During this century of humiliation, China had suffered from what they call imperialism. And this is kind of when outside nations come in and take control over certain areas, geographic areas of China. This depiction on one side here is a political cartoon of the Western and Asian powers carving up China like a pie for every piece for themselves. You can see in the sphere of influence in 1910, which is the last year of the Qing Empire, where there was areas of control. For example, the Yangtze River. You can imagine where the British had control and freedom of navigation of the Yangtze River, and the Chinese government had no control. It'd be equivalent of somebody of the United States losing control of the Mississippi. and having any country bring up their battleships all the way through up into Missouri. That's what China suffered at the time. Lost control over significant ports and also areas of control from Tibet to up to Russia, Far East. 1937 and 1945, China suffered from Japanese occupation. During World War II, you can see the areas in red where the Japanese occupied and controlled parts of China. There was also the Chinese Communist Party and the nationalists who were also fighting each other and the Japanese. The Japanese occupation is still a historical continuity that many Chinese feel and kind of understand today. Much of this century of humiliation is still in textbooks and the education system, televisions, movies. The rape in Nanjing, you can see here in the images, are these images that still resonate today in China. Now, between 1945 and 1949, after the end of World War II, there was a civil war between the Chinese communists and the nationalists. The Chinese communists won the civil war, and October 1st, 1949 is considered National Liberation Day, or Chinese Independence Day. Mao Zedong was a preeminent leader at the time, and Chinese citizens were told that the century of humiliation was over, and that never again. And the Chinese Communist Party started to take control over the economy. They nationalized all industries, companies, and stores, and everything was to become government-owned and state-owned. Land reform was one of the first things that the Chinese Communist Party performed that would help the citizens of China, because at the time, 85% of the population lived in the countryside, in villages, working on small farms. So before 1950, about 10% of the rural population owned land. The rest were tenant farmers. After 1950, the Chinese Communist Party confiscated and redistributed all the land in the Chinese countryside. So there was a complete redistribution of land to where every farmer had their own plots of land. However, in 1954, the Chinese Communist Party started to collectivize the land. So as soon as the farmers received deeds for their own land, they had to give it back to local officials, and they started to work on collectivized larger farms in order to produce more grain to feed the population. Collectivization is a process where agricultural land was removed from private ownership and organized into large state farms, collective farms. The rural population were organized into people's communes, and this basically represented the vast majority of the population from the mid-1950s into the early 1980s. These were basically controlled and were in charge of all aspects of social, political, and economic life in the Chinese countryside. These are pictures of people working on the communes, and you can see that they were all working on the same plots of land. This meant, so at the commune, they were all working together on larger plots of land, and they all did it at the same time and put all their own work into it. So nobody worked their own land. This was communal. After collectivization, no one individually owns land. It is either state-owned by city governments or collectively owned by rural areas. And this is still the case in 2021. Farmers lease land from local governments, but do not own the actual deed. The actual land ownership is still in the hands of local government. One of the biggest tragedies that occurred in the late 1950s was a great leap forward. Mao Zedong attempted to industrialize China very rapidly, and it propelled it to get closer to communism. The leap was intended to be an opportunity to develop the countryside and the city at the same time. However, it basically became one of the worst famines in human history. Close to around 20 million people died. It was a combination of bad weather and bad policies that combined to create this tremendous disaster. A few years after that, the Great Leap Forward lasted from 1958 to about 1960. By 1961, 1962, Chinese economy started to get back going again. Communes were producing more. But by 1966, Mao Zedong put a stop to that kind of development, and he wanted again to make moved closer towards socialism. But what he did is he created the Great Cultural Revolution, and it was basically an attempt to create mass rallies and mass revolution to upend the current cadres and political system at the time in order to create a more revolutionary China. Mao Zedong fought high and smashed counter-revolutionary and revisionist literature and art. This is in 1967. At the height of the Cultural Revolution, older cadres and people who worked hard to bring Chinese out of poverty were punished, and they were struggled against. Everything from teachers to local officials. The whole society was put up on end. It's called the 10 Bad Years. Schools were closed, factories closed, the communes didn't function as well, and it was basically revolutionary chaos. And it created a tremendous amount of instability in China at the time. After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, it pretty much brought an end to the Cultural Revolution. And in that, Deng Xiaoping rose as a national leader. Deng Xiaoping wanted less revolution and more economic, stable development. He created a new constitution in 1982, and he ended the rural communes and agricultural collectivization. The Chinese Communist Party was to lead China through a gradual capitalist market reforms. So this is really interesting. The Chinese Communist Party is leading the Chinese economy through capitalist market reforms. This is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is how you can have capitalist economy and still have the leadership be called the Communist Party. This changed China's economy from mostly agricultural and lower income to higher levels of manufacturing, industrialization with increasing incomes for Chinese citizens. The end of the rural communes meant that each household would get to farm their own plots of land. This is called the household responsibility system. So instead of seeing all the farmers getting out in the village and working on the same larger plots of land, you can see here, this is a villager that I stayed with in his home in the late 1990s. And that plot of land you see right behind him, that long stretch of dirt, that's his family plot. The green right next to him, that belongs to another family. And the one on the other side belongs to another family. And you'll find it's kind of interesting. He's also a teacher. So he's in a leather jacket and black dress shoes while he's out quickly farming a little bit before he goes back to his classroom. You can also see smaller harvesters. And you can see here in the background of that top picture, the wheat is unharvested because they decided to do it themselves. But the plot of land ahead of them, right towards the picture, that's a harvester. They go from village to village, and the farmers would pay them to harvest. And again, you can see smaller harvesters because of the smaller plots of land. Land is the most important resource in China. And even today, in 2021, it is not privately owned. But because of these smaller plots of land, it's harder to produce larger agricultural output. So that is always kind of the tug and pull on the pros and cons of Chinese agriculture. Major social changes from 1980 to 2020. In 1980, 80% of the Chinese population lived in the countryside. They were considered rural. By 2020, 40% lives in the rural areas. It is the fastest level of urbanization we've seen to this day. In 1980, few rural residents were able to migrate to the cities to find jobs or to leave the countryside. But by 2020, there's an estimated 250 million rural to urban migrants migrating from the countryside to the cities in China today. In 1980, most Chinese did not have running water in their homes, such as flush toilets, showers, hot and cold running water. By 2020, the vast majority of Chinese have these basic amenities. Most Chinese now live in high rises. Close to 60% live in the urban areas, and most urban areas have high-rise apartments with most of the comforts of modern comforts we would see and basically assume we would get in these more urban settings. And again, from a Chinese perspective, this is a positive development, right? And these are the apartment complexes that are rising in China and continue today. But with increased incomes and urbanization also means greater challenges, from waste management to air pollution and traffic. As people's income rises, everybody wanted to buy their own cars, particularly in the urban areas. But that also meant a tremendous amount of traffic. And traffic issues are still a very real and serious problem in China. Waste management. As cities develop, you have solid waste, liquid waste, air pollution that continues to be a significant challenge for China as they develop. China is one of the leading contributors to climate change or the climate crisis, particularly the emissions of greenhouse gas. About 60% to 65% of Chinese energy is based on coal. So burning coal, particularly in the wintertime, is a very significant and very real issue for air pollution. But China is also one of the leading nations to combat climate change in developing air and developing hydroelectric, solar panels, wind turbines. China really is moving forward, electric cars. So China is becoming one of the leading countries in this green technology. So here we see this remarkable contradiction going on within China. There's also a growing gap between rich and poor, rural and urban. As we can see, the incomes have increased for everybody. From in 1978 at the beginning, in 1980 at the beginning of the reforms, everybody was the same. There was no gap, everybody was poor. But by the time they started to increase these incomes, the quality of life improved for everybody. But that gap between rich and poor continues, and that gap between rural and urban, not just for incomes, but in the quality of education, healthcare, access to water. These are things that are really kind of starting to challenge some of this development. Yet, despite these challenges, most Chinese still support the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese learned from public education, the history, as well as television and movies, that China has risen from a century of humiliation to a world-class power. From that lowest level of development and that humiliation power that in the 1940s and 1930s to now a world-class power is something that is taken in pride from all Chinese. Sons and daughters have a better life than their parents and their grandparents. So this explains why we observe this high level of public support for the Chinese Communist Party and the central government for now. So thank you for this, allowing me to present you this short introduction to China. I also want to say thank you, 谢谢. For more information about China, as well as Korea and Japan, see the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas website at ceas.ku.edu.